Hello, everyone. It's great to see you all here for this session on new disabled fairy tales. My name is Catherine Duckett, and I'm an author. I write science fiction, fantasy, and horror, but I'm also an editor, and I edited the Uncanny Magazine issue of Disabled People Destroy Fantasy. So specifically soliciting work from disabled creators, and have contributed to many other disabled creator-focused anthologies as well. So I am really excited to talk to you all about this topic today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Right? And I'm hoping that everyone can see that fine. I'm just going to check. Okay. And I should mention my pronouns are she, her, and if you can't see me, I'm a white woman with long brown hair. I'm wearing a blue shirt, a dark blue shirt, and a necklace. And so here we are. This is a session on transforming the castle, new disabled fairy tales. And this title is actually taken from one of the texts we'll be using today. And, oh, great, yeah, presenter. Thank you. And I really encourage you all to take a look at this issue. There's a lot of great work in the Disabled People Destroy Fantasy issue on fairy tales specifically. And this title came to me in part from the nonfiction editorial written by Nicolette Bereshoff, which was really all about kind of a call to arms for disabled creators to expand our castle of speculative fiction and branch out and experiment and keep telling our stories in new and different ways. So I'm excited to talk about that today. Part of what I'm going to talk about is the history of disability and fairy tales. So I do want to let everyone know, just as a content warning, there will be discussions of ableism in this presentation. And I also wanted to let everyone know we are focused largely on the Grimm's canon. So it is going to be a westernized canon and a westernized lens. That's partly because I want to stay in my lane in terms of my scholarship and the text that I'm using, and not do a disservice to other stories that might not be best served by this particular lens. But just bear in mind that any time that we talk about ableism and we talk about bringing this lens of disability theory, that's going to intersect with race and class and gender and sexuality. So there's a lot more here to explore, more than we're going to be able to get to in just an hour. But I encourage you to explore this further. And also, if you have recommendations in the chat for anything you'd like to shout out as further reading, I would really welcome that. So I mentioned one of the texts that we'll be using is Disabled People Destroy Fantasy. And that's partly because that is what got me thinking about all of this. I was the fiction editor, and I had a few solicited pieces, but I also opened up, submissions. Uncanny Magazine opened up submissions widely, and I was so interested to see how many fairy tale retellings I got. And so how many disabled people were drawn to working with fairy tales specifically. And it wasn't something I had totally thought about before, but it's something we did explore in the issue. And the other text that I'll be using quite extensively is Amanda Leduc's Disfigured. So this just came out fairly recently. It's the full title is Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space. And it's just a really terrific overview of everything we're going to be discussing today, with lots of great ideas for further reading as well. So I really encourage you to get your hands on that. So let's jump into it. I've already mentioned a little bit of what will be going on over today. But I just first want to let you know we'll be talking about what a fairy tale even is, because that's actually harder to pin down than you might think. What's the history of disability in fairy tales, because that's quite complex as well. And how can we as creators reshape fairy tales and fairy tale inspired fantasy? Because quite a lot of fantasy takes, its tropes and its inspiration from the fairy tale template to center and reflect the complex realities of disabled and chronically ill people. So that's what I'm hoping you'll get out of the session today. So a very, very brief history of fairy tales, caveat that there's a lot more to know here, but just in case you're not that familiar with the history or need a refresher, these are oral stories. They were originally oral stories passed from person to person, and they started to be collected and popularized around the Renaissance and a little later. So you can find a lot of these texts in Italian. And they were later taken and recontextualized and collected by anthologists in France and Germany and Denmark. And really at that point saw this resurgence in popularity where they were sort of everywhere and became part of people's lives and people's bookshelves and formed a key part of our Western canon. So it's actually, as I mentioned, pretty hard to define exactly what a fairy tale is. There's a lot of debate on this among fairy tale scholars. And one of the things that we can all pretty much agree on is that there needs to be something magical happening. There's a great essay from J.R.R. Tolkien about how fairy tales need to feature elements of fairy. So that's something that he admits is very hard to pin down, but it's a certain type of the fantastical that you can recognize in these stories. So you do sort of know it when you see it. And these stories also, they possess their own internal logic. So they kind of take place in these strange worlds where things happen that we may not fully understand, but there seems to be a logic to them within the stories. There's a lot of power around naming, for instance. And so again, it's a world that if you become familiar with it, if you read enough of these stories, you start to recognize this wider world and some of the odd features of it. Fairy tales may well involve a quest. They don't always have to, but they often do. And several scholars have pointed out that they think one of the key features of fairy tales is that they involve transformation. And this really interests me and is part of what I find a defining feature of fairy tales, because I think, as we're going to discuss a little more, this is one of the reasons that you see disability used so much in fairy tales, because there is this idea of focusing on the body and the individual and transforming to fit a relationship or society. And disability in many ways becomes a stand-in for that or a metaphor. So let's talk a little bit about the history of disability in fairy tales. From that Uncanny Magazine issue that I mentioned, there's a terrific article that was one of the things that got me thinking about this. It's by Carrie Marin, and it's called The Blind Prince Reimagined, Disability in Fairy Tales. And it really breaks down a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, which is how omnipresent disability is in fairy tales. And it's surprising when you start looking for it, suddenly it's everywhere, just as this quote says. So this quote says, disability in fairy tales is almost invariably something to be overcome. Disability is everywhere in fairy tales if you look for it, as an obstacle, a source of ridicule, or both. And someone has asked in the chat if this definition excludes mundane folktales. Yeah, there is a lot of debate about where the line falls between fairy tales and folktales. For the purposes of this discussion, since it is so Grimm and Anderson centric, I'm keeping to the narrower definition, but a lot of what we'll talk about will have some portability into folktales as well, and larger ramifications for all of those, the literary traditions that come from oral retellings. Okay, so now that we know that disability is everywhere in these tales, let's talk about how it often shows up. And Kari goes into a lot of these in her essay, but I wanted to focus on some of the 4 main ways that you see disability show up again and again. And we'll talk about specific examples of these in the next slide. But the first way that you see disability surface is as punishment. So very frequently in fairy tales, you will see characters become disabled as a punishment, either as a cruel sort of curse for some misstep in the story, or because they haven't been good enough or virtuous enough. So you do see this really problematic trope of disability just really being coded as punishment. You also see disability as obstacle. So this often is true of the protagonists. Often disability is sort of thrown into their path as something that they need to overcome to reach the happy ending at the end of the story. So many reasons this is an issue, obviously. But one of the big issues with this trope is that it replicates the extraordinary disabled person trope that we see throughout media these days, the sort of superhuman disabled person compensating for their disability and that essentially erasing their disability or quote unquote making up for it. Oh yes, I'm just checking on the chat. And yes, I was specifically referring to J.R. Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. So thank you for double checking that. So yes, disability as obstacle. And the next one is disability as loss of agency. So this is a trope that we see a lot. It's not just that a character has a disability, it's that that disability represents a complete loss of their agency and ability to do anything or make any choices within the story. And so many issues with this, and obviously it doesn't reflect the reality, the lived experience of disabled people at all. These disabilities that we're going to discuss would not somehow just, necessarily lead to a complete lack of agency, but these disabilities really symbolize that complete loss of agency within the story. And they're often used to symbolize the utter despair and the depths that these characters have fallen to before they overcome them. And part of the issue with the overcoming narrative is that it vanishes disability. There isn't a happy ending for disabled characters because by the end, they're usually not disabled. And this is something that Kari talks about in her essay, is wanting to rewrite fairy tales in her head all the time. Because why can't the disabled characters stay disabled by the end of the tale and still experience that happy ending and go on to live full lives? And the last trope that I want to talk about is disability as mark of moral deficiency or inhumanity. So if you've studied disability in media at all, this is something that will be familiar to you. The idea that disability somehow marks villainy or marks this immorality. And so that's something you see a lot with these villains in these tales. There's some sort of disfigurement. There's something that often is permanent. It's not presented like it is for the protagonist as something they can overcome and change. It's more a feature of them that is meant to tell you this person is bad. So those are the tropes that we're dealing with. And next, I want us to take a look at some specific examples here. So the first example, this is the story that Kari was referencing in her essay, The Blind Prince Reimagined, and that's the story of Rapunzel. So in the Grimm's version of Rapunzel, the witch uses blindness to punish the prince for visiting Rapunzel. And this leads to essentially a total loss of his agency. He just wanders in the woods. He's sort of helpless and hopeless. And it's Rapunzel's tears, actually, that restore his sight. So those tears are really a stand-in in many ways for Rapunzel's pity. And this will be a theme that you'll see repeated throughout these stories, is that it's, this pitiful condition. And so it's only through another character overcoming, their pity and horror that this disabled character can achieve some sort of integration into society. The next story is Cinderella. Blindness is also used there as punishment. It's used as punishment for the stepsisters. They have their eyes pecked out. And interestingly, they also injure themselves in their attempt to make the glass slipper fit their feet. So there's kind of this use of this grotesque idea of mutilation there. Another famous story that you may have come across that it directly deals with disability is the handless maiden or the armless maiden. And in this story, the woman, through a series of events involving her father and the devil, loses her arms, and she again experiences a total loss of agency. She once again must wander in the woods. And she does not actually, there is a version where she gets silver hands made for her by a king who loves her, but they're not presented to us as though they're necessarily a helpful prosthetic or anything that actually assists her. They seem to be somewhat of a token of his love. So the issue with this is that you'll see this again and again in these stories. You have disabled character, many of them with disabilities that we have ourselves today, and there's no adaptive technology used, there's no sign language, there's no attempt to change the world, to make it more accessible to these disabled characters. And again, their agency is completely lost with this disability. So the next one that I want to talk about, a very famous one, of course, The Little Mermaid. And The Little Mermaid, you may or may not know, but in the Anderson version, she has chronic pain. She accepts this chronic pain as the price of getting legs. So essentially, transitioning from the sea to land causes her to have chronic pain. She feels as though she's treading upon sharp knives while on land, and she's unable to communicate. So again, not only does she lose her voice in the bargain, but there's no attention paid to other ways that she could communicate. There's no sign language, there's no, apparently no attempt to communicate with her through writing. So again, we see this loss of agency and this representation of the loss of being able to communicate vocally as standing in for total loss of communication. And we'll talk a little bit about that more. And yes, the next one, Beauty and the Beast. This is a good example of a character being sort of disability coded. And specifically, you see this trope again and again of where is the line between human and non-human. And that's something that the stories are very concerned about. It actually comes up in The Little Mermaid as well, because the Little Mermaid in the Anderson version does not have a soul. Part of what she is trying to achieve is a soul. And essentially the conclusion of the story, which is actually very tragic in many ways in that version, is that she can perhaps, if she works hard enough in the afterlife, earn herself a soul. So there's this real policing of the line between human and non-human, and using characters to, stand in for this idea that there is a way to be sort of a non-human human. And I have a quote here from Tobin Siebers, who's a disability theorist, that really summarizes this for me. The ideology of ability is at its simplest the preference for able-bodiedness. At its most radical, it defines the baseline by which humanness is determined, setting the measure of body and mind that gives or denies human status to individual persons. So that's part of why I really wanted to discuss that trope and the fact that it comes up again and again in fairy tales, is it's often trying to deny that status in many ways to disabled persons or disabled coded characters, and deny them that agency, and essentially tell the story that you need to change yourself, you need to transform to integrate yourself into this human society. And the last one I want to talk about is the 12 brothers. So this appears again and again, actually, in various forms. There's also the six swans and the wild swans. They're variants of the stories. And so in this story, the sister of the 12 brothers must remain mute to restore her brothers from swan to human form. And this is interesting for the Grimms in particular. Were a bit infamous for reducing the dialogue for their women. The characters in these stories suddenly had a lot less agency and a lot less to say. And so you do see this trope come up again and again with them, of the silent woman. And part of what they were representing there was the idea that a silent woman or a quiet woman is a virtuous woman, reflecting the societal ideas of their times. But again, as we've discussed before, this mutism represented complete loss of communication and agency. She's able to nod, essentially, but we don't get any other means for her to communicate or tell her story before she's almost actually burned at the stake. So again, it's just completely removing the ability for this disabled character to function in the story as a real complex person. I'm just checking in here. Yes, good point. And the 12 brothers, someone noted in the chat, also has physical punishment pain for the sister as well, since she has to weave stinging nettles constantly. Very good point. Okay. So the history of disability in fairy tales. To continue on this, I really wanted to highlight this quote from Amanda Leduc again. This is from Disfigured. In fairy tales, the transformation of the individual relies on fairies and magic, or the gods, because it is understood that society itself can't, and indeed won't, improve. So this you see over and over again in the world of fairy tales. The world of fairy tales never really changes. The burden of transformation is on the individual, and it's on the individual to make themselves acceptable or ready for society or some societal role. And I know we noted some examples on the last slide. I just want to say there are many more, and I think people are sharing some in the chat. But yeah, there are many examples. One that Disfigured focuses on is Hans my Hedgehog, which is about a half human, half hedgehog boy. So again, treading that line between human and non-human. And I would say the overall moral of that story is have a can-do attitude, which we hear a lot today as disabled people, and you will overcome. And in the end, actually, he just transforms into fully human. So again, we see an erasure of anything that made him distinctive in that world. So I want to talk a little bit specifically about the Grimms, because the Grimms inserted quite a lot of instances of disability into their stories, which is really, really interesting. And part of this was that both of the Grimms, but in particular Wilhelm, experienced many health problems throughout their lives. So Wilhelm in particular had a chronic health condition and was quite concerned about it. We have letters and journals that indicate this was something he spent quite a lot of time worrying about and thinking about. And so you see this show up in their collection of fairy tales. and show up in really interesting ways. And part of his aim in collecting these stories was to make the tales narratively complete. So what he felt was needed with these stories was to fill in context and characterization that was missing. So remember that these were oral tales that had many, many different versions, many overlapping versions, many contradictory versions. So they were not wrapped up into a neat package. The things that happened in them didn't necessarily go straight from cause to effect and follow a linear logic. They were a complicated trove of stories, but part of what the Grimms wanted to do, they wanted to make these complete stories, and they wanted to almost perform this sort of surgery on them to make them complete in a way they felt was satisfying. And there's a great quote here in Disfigured about this. And it has to do with the fact that so often in these stories, the narrative focuses on something that is lacking at the beginning of the narrative and then is fulfilled by the end of the narrative. So it moves, that pattern moves from uncertainty, something that is needed, something that is lacking, to balance. And there's a great, we're going to talk a little bit more about a great text from a scholar, Schmiesing, who says, this pattern of moving from a lack to fulfillment moves from disequilibrium to equilibrium, from disenchantment to enchantment, and from disability to ability and bodily perfection. So in many ways, what the Grimms were doing with these stories changed them and reflected this idea, their idea of what perfection and wholeness was. And also in the Grimm's worldview, as we've noted, society wasn't going to change. So actually, interestingly, in many ways, they almost did prefigure and agree with the social model of disability, where it is the social construct that causes the idea of disability, because they did acknowledge that the society was not going to shift, the society was not going to accommodate, and the society was not going to make things any more accessible. But that meant that what was needed to quote unquote fix disability was divine intervention. And non-disability, moving from a state of disability to non-disability, was often a magical reward, a reward for being virtuous or patient or self-sacrificing that would release you from being disabled. And in these stories, actually, able-bodiedness was the ideal, not the norm. So in many ways, that reflected the Grimm's real society, where people were not actually, you know, just all hale and healthy and hearty the way that the Grimms wanted to envision them being. They had a whole project in many ways for these to be these Germanic folk tales that you know, spoke to the glory of these hale, hearty people. And but actually, they recognized in many ways in these stories that's not real. That's not all around us. And so disability is commonplace in their fairy tales. And in fact, as I noted, they insert many, many more instances of it into the stories as they collect them. Yes, and someone says, given how much the Grimms put of their own ideas into their collection, we could almost call them fairy tale retellers instead of collectors. And yes, they did quite a lot of retelling and reworking and reimagining themselves. So moving on, I want to talk a little bit about the way that disability is purely used as metaphor in these stories. And there are obviously many, many reasons why this is an issue, but let me go ahead and share this quote from Anne Schmiesing. And this is from a text called Disability, Deformity, and Disease in the Grimm's Fairy Tales. And Disfigured draws on that text, and I encourage you also, you can find that online. to investigate that text more as well. Reading disability merely as a metaphor for something else is in itself a form of erasure because it abstracts the disabled individual. So just seeing these disabled characters as standing in for something else, as just symbols, takes away the lived experience, takes away the reality of their bodies in these environments, and takes away any possibility that they could live with these disabilities, because they're just meant to be symbols and they're meant to serve a symbolic function that will be resolved by the end of the story. And so Amanda Leduc also expands on this idea in Disfigured by saying, we turn disability into a symbol because it has been socialized to be not useful, a burden on society, an uncomfortable ending. If disability is instead seen as a metaphor, there is potential for the happy ending as the able-bodied world knows it to be truly achieved. If a disability is not a disability so much as a symbol of something else, then only that symbol is realized, the disability can go away. So that's really what we're seeing in a lot of these stories. If the symbol goes away, then the disability goes away, because it's really just meant to stand in for another kind of conflict or another kind of transformation. So I want to go ahead and move on actually to talking about how disabled creators are approaching these retellings. Because I think disabled creators are doing some really interesting things. And again, I would encourage anyone who has other things to shout out in the chat to share those, because I think there's a huge range of works by disabled creators that draw in fairy tale elements. But I wanted to focus on these stories from the Disabled People Destroy Fantasy issue, because they're the stories that got me interested in this topic. And they're the stories that I worked with and worked with these authors on. And I don't want to in any way say, this is how you have to interpret these stories. I think these stories are incredibly complex. There's a lot of different things that different readers are going to take away from these stories. But I do want to say that there were so many things that struck me as being particular in these stories to subverting or reimagining aspects of what we've talked about in terms of the history of disability in these fairy tales. So the first one that I want to talk about is Tower by Lane Waldman. So this is a reimagining of Rapunzel. And the short version of the story is that a witch and a woman who may or may not be related are living in a tower. And they're living in a tower that is isolated, but seems to be in our modern era. They have cable, for instance. And the electrician is the person who comes to their house and is maybe a promise of rescue rather than the prince. And they both have a condition in the story that causes their hair to grow ceaselessly, and it also hurts physically to cut their hair. So they both have this condition, and it's part of what is keeping them in this tower. And I would encourage you, if you go out and read this story, I would really encourage you to also read the accompanying interview by Lane Waldman, because they talk a lot about their creation of this story and aspects of what we're going to be discussing here. And one of the things that they talk about is how this story in particular deals with ageism. So you have two characters that have the same condition, but they're treated very differently within the text. And it's acknowledged that the daughter is seen as having this societal story of being the potential princess, the person who can, quote unquote, escape disability, even though she really can't. And that her mother in many ways is seen as the villain or someone who is trapped within the story. And it deals with those generational relationships regarding disability. It deals with their connection to one another and what they're going through as they live through this situation together and how they're both navigating it. And the central metaphor here of the ceaselessly growing hair doesn't erase the reality of disability, because it's not a real condition. It doesn't mirror a real condition. It's purely magical. And it actually opens up connection to myriad other experiences with disability. So Lane talks about this in their interview, about where this came from for them in terms of their disability and representing their disability. And I think there are many other readings you could bring to this central metaphor. And so part of what I wanted to know is, obviously, when dealing with disability in these fairy tale retellings, you don't just have to necessarily strip this metaphor, this metaphorical language, this symbolism away, because that is how we communicate. That is how we relate as storytellers, obviously. But you want to make sure that your metaphor is not erasing the reality of anyone's lived experience. And you don't want to take someone's very real disability and lived experience and turn it into a parallel or a symbolic link for something else that you're trying to get across in the story. The other thing I wanted to focus on here is that the protagonist in this story, the woman, the daughter, she possesses agency and autonomy within the reality of disability. So there's not an attempt to erase the reality of what she's going through, the facts of her life and her lived experience, but she is making choices, and she is thinking about her options and her future, and she is able to act within the story. And so I really wanted to just make a point about that, because I think so often when we talk about agency, that can be complicated for disabled creators. I know it's been complicated for me because there's this idea that you have to strip away anything that's quote unquote passive about a character, that is what's taking away agency, and that makes a character look weak, for instance. But I think when you're dealing with the reality of writing as a disabled creator, your characters might not, their agency might not look like a non-disabled character. There may be other ways that they are reacting within the story, that they are making choices, that they are affecting their world. And so that's something that all of the stories we're going to talk about do. They center the agency with the disabled character. And I think that's really, really important. And the other thing that this story does is it reflects lived experience. So as I mentioned, if you read that interview with Lane, they talk about where this came from for them, and the very real things that they were going through that led to the creation of this story, and how they reflected that in this narrative. The other thing that I found really interesting from reading their interview, that I actually didn't realize until I read their interview, was that so many of the early readers on this story told them to simplify it, essentially. The narrative has multiple endings. It has these sort of branching possibilities. And many readers told them to change that and take that out, and they didn't feel like that was the way to go. And I found that really striking as the person who bought the story, because that was actually part of why I bought the story. I was so interested in this idea of fracturing the perceived wholeness of the narrative and playing with this idea that there were different directions that this might go, and different directions that the protagonist's mind essentially was going in as she was considering her situation. So I liked how that complicated the notions of linearity and that wholeness of narrative. Again, kind of in reaction to the Grimms, who wanted to make these kind of simpler narratives. I like the idea of threading that complication back in. The next story that I want to talk about is The Tailor and the Beast by Aisha Farah. And this is a great Beauty and the Beast retelling. This story features an aging tailor who takes his daughter's place in the enchanted castle to become the Beast's companion. He keeps his daughter safe, by offering himself up in her place. And part of what I think is great about this story is it features two disabled or disabled coded characters. There's not just the narrative of the one and the one who must change. As you get in Beauty and the Beast, Beauty and the Beast is very much a narrative of a woman who is a paragon of beauty and virtue, and her willingness to try to accept this man who she perceives as disfigured. And in this many versions of the Beauty and the Beast tale too, her willingness to marry him is gradual. And it's something she essentially feels she has to overcome his appearance, and she feels he doesn't compensate enough for how he looks with his conversation or with any other traits. So again, we get that idea that there needs to be compensation in order for someone to be worthy of that recognition of humanness. And so part of what I enjoyed about this retelling was that you have two characters, both perceived by their societies as disabled. The Tailor has depression. He also has physical disabilities, in part from his work. And there is no overcoming of the beast's appearance or person to have a relationship, for them to connect. That doesn't have to happen. The Tailor never sees the beast as hideous, and they really just coexist and learn to live with one another. And the other thing I enjoyed so much about the story was that the Tailor creates adaptive technologies for the beast. He sees the beast reading books and tearing them with his claws, and he creates gloves for him. So there's a very simple, it seems like such a simple act and such a simple change to respond to the reality of a disabled character in a fairy tale and think, okay, what do you actually need? What would be helpful? But you so rarely see that in the original tales. And so even that can be a bit of a revolutionary act to bring that in. And the other thing that I think is important in this retelling is that economic and societal pressure is part of the narrative and the construction of disability. So partly what's happened here is the Tailor is depressed and can't work quite the way that he used to. And so that has led to a loss of income, and that has led to his status in the society now. The other thing that I think is important as far as the magic that's baked in here is that the body is not destiny. So in many ways, we get the Beauty and the Beast, that they experience true love, and that's the transformation. But in many ways, it's really more about the beast getting on Beauty's level. Beauty represents the perfection, the apex of virtue in the society, and that's what in many ways he's ascending to. But the Tailor transforms the beast with a kiss, despite not being the quote unquote right body for the role. He says, I hadn't considered myself in the running, but look, we've actually formed this relationship and this connection. So the last story I want to talk about is not a straight up retelling, but does bring in elements of fairy tales and folk tales. And that's Away with the Wolves by Sarah Gailey. And the quick synopsis of this story is that a young woman with chronic pain finds relief in her ability to transform into a wolf, but is accused of causing destruction to her village in her wolf body. And she has a complicated relationship with the community. Part of what I enjoy about the story is that she does have a relationship with the community. She's very much a part of her community, and in many ways, they are trying to find ways to accommodate her, but they're not always succeeding at that. And Sarah Gailey has a great interview you can go listen to on the Uncanny Magazine podcast, all about that relationship between the young woman who's transforming and the village. And also the idea that Gailey wanted to make sure that the choices were entirely in the protagonist's hands. And so even well-meaning friends and allies may not make the right choices, or just aren't the person to make the choices for the person who is disabled. And so really what this story revolves around is the protagonist having to decide when she's going to change from wolf to human, where she wants to spend her time, and what the trade-offs are in terms of the pain that she's experiencing and her access to certain experiences. And part of what I also enjoyed about this is that it illustrates the realities of complex embodiment. So that's a disability theory that essentially combines the social theory of disability, right? Where disability is socially constructed. And really the issue is more how society creates barriers for people with certain bodies, and that's what creates disability. It takes that, but also combines it with the idea that there are some lived realities of being in certain disabled bodies, like chronic pain, for instance. And so this story really deals in a visceral way with what it is to experience pain and what it is to have to make choices around pain. And that's part of what I, as someone with chronic pain, really enjoyed about it, is it dealt very much with the reality of that, how you might want to escape that, how you might have to negotiate that, and how other people might feel about your choices. So I definitely suggest taking a look at this story as well and listening to that interview. So creating new disabled fairy tales to things to consider. So these are things that I think there's a lot you can take away from what we talked about today. But if there were a few things that I would ask you to think about and focus on as you come away from this session, these are things that I would keep in your mind. And this is true whether you are a disabled creator creating these stories, or if you want to try to write disability in fairy tales. The first thing I would say, the most important thing I think that we've talked about, is that you really need to center the experience and agency of disabled characters. So are disabled characters in the narrative the ones making the choices? And also, is the experience of disabled characters in the narrative, is it real? Are they responding the way that disabled people would actually be responding in the world, right? Disabled people do not experience a complete loss of agency when things change in their bodies or minds. So how can you reflect that real experience in your narrative? And this leads into my next point. Write disability as a lived reality, not merely metaphor. So make sure that disability in your story is not just a stand-in for something else, that you are considering all the aspects, that even in a world that is completely unlike our own, even in these fairy tale settings, you are thinking through how would this character actually be responding to their needs, to their wants. And a way that you can start to do that is to prioritize research and analysis from disabled communities. So I'll just shout out one more time, Disfigured, Amanda Leduc's great book on this very subject we've been talking about. But of course, anytime you're writing outside of your experience, or even if you're writing, I think personally for me, within my experience, I definitely like to seek out other voices, other angles within the realm of that experience, and make sure that I've fully understood what I'm delving into. And part of why I think that's important is, as we've talked about here, there are so many harmful ableist tropes baked into these stories that have been passed down. And we want to dismantle those. We want to make sure that we're not replicating those. And we want to make sure we're not further entrenching those ableist tropes. So learning about these histories is important. It can be obviously tough and uncomfortable, but I think it's important to recognize these because they have shown up now in so many ways, divorced from the original intent of the people who maybe put them in. And so the last thing I'll leave you with is make sure you're always examining the ableist foundations of world building and fairy tales. So we've talked about this, but this is the ways that maybe the magic is ableist, right? the ways that the narrative arcs are set up to erase disability or to make disability a burden or an obstacle. It's important to do this when doing fairy tale retellings, but it's important in fantasy generally, because so many of these stories have lent themselves to our fantasy writing and literature, and they do unfortunately show up again and again. So I think we're out of time, but I will answer any questions in the chat. And I want to thank you all again for coming and hearing me speak on this tonight. And I hope you will continue to engage on this subject and seek out more work and more retellings from disabled creators. Thanks.